that you could see a huge blowout and have water rushing everywhere, potentially getting into a basement or a subfloor or something. So you do want to pay attention to that. And so that's what I've noticed, is that the IBCs that are getting toward the end of their useful life, if you hear a crackling in the plastic, you might want to avoid those IBCs. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Brian, and I have been buying IBCs. These are intermediate bulk containers. I've been buying and selling IBCs now for several years. I've literally bought and sold hundreds of these. And the primary use that I sell them for is people using them to collect rainwater. We're in California, so any rainwater that we get is a really precious resource, and people want to save it for use in the garden. So I've learned quite a lot about IBCs over the years, and I thought I would share some of what I've learned dealing in them and learning all kinds of different variations and all kinds of weird little idiosyncrasies that they have. I want to first start by talking about the size of IBCs. So IBC stands for intermediate bulk container, and that means it's not some giant water truck, but it's also not some 55-gallon barrel. It's somewhere in between. And so the way the math works out, this is a 275-gallon IBC here, and that is 5 of these 55-gallon drums. This larger IBC here, this is a 330-gallon IBC, and that amounts to 6 of these 55-gallon drums. So that's the way these sizes work, is they're all multiples of 55. So that makes it really easy to think, if you're currently collecting rainwater with 55-gallon barrels, say you've got 2 of them, if you wanted to triple your system and make it 3 times as large, you'd go with a 330-gallon IBC, and that would be exactly 6 of these total. Now, the number one question I get asked is, when I store water in these, can I drink the water out of them? And that depends on a lot of different things, and so you're going to have to make that decision for yourself and for your family. But there are 2 rules of thumb that people tend to use. The first is, you want to make sure that the IBC that you're using for water, for drinking water, is a food grade IBC. We'll talk a bit more about that later. The second thing you want to make sure of is that whatever you've stored in the IBC, it's always been some food product, and it hasn't been something like motor oil or gasoline, right? You wouldn't want to store your drinking water in the same IBC that had some nasty chemical like that. And there's a lot more that goes into it, unfortunately, and we're not really going to get into the video today about all the things you need to do to make sure it's drinkable. But that's kind of a good starting point, is make sure it's food grade and make sure that only food has been transported in it. Now, there are actually some IBCs that have kind of a pedigree, and you can see all the things that have been carried in it. So if it's a food grade tote, food grade IBC, there'd be a little track record of saying it had this and this and this and this to make sure that you actually had only food items in it. And so if you're lucky enough to find an IBC that has one of those pedigrees, then you can have some confidence that it's safe to use for drinking water. But those are less common. More often you're going to find an IBC that is just, someone's got a food grade IBC, they don't know what was in it before, but they've got it, and you have to kind of make the decision on your own. Do I want to use it for drinking water, or do I want to play it safe and just use it for rainwater and using in the garden? For a food grade IBC, this is what you would look for. There's a symbol on it, and it has a little wine glass and a fork. And obviously, just because you find a food grade tote doesn't mean you would want to drink anything out of it. This is a great example here where this IBC has been trashed. It's obviously pretty old, and there's no telling what has been stored in this before. So that's, one thing to keep in mind is, what's the physical condition of the food grade IBC? And if it's something like this, just say no, kids. It can be a little bit more subtle though. So here's an IBC. It's in great physical condition. It's relatively clean. It's got the food grade seal on it, but unfortunately, this IBC contained nitrogen fertilizer. And so you look in here, it's relatively clean, but most definitely as I open that up, I'm getting the whiff of nitrogen fertilizer. It's not an open and shut case of, if it has a food grade seal, I can drink out of it. Not necessarily, because you don't know what was in it before. Now, just because an IBC isn't food grade doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be dirty. And so this is a great example here where this IBC, this is actually a first use IBC. And what that means is that the person I bought it from used it only once, and so it's basically brand new. And if you look down here, they did a really good job cleaning it. It's basically pristine in there. It's not food grade, so I wouldn't use this for drinking water. But it is basically as clean as you're ever going to find for a used IBC, because it's only, it's brand new except for its first use. You know, if you had a need and you were, you know, in sort of a survival situation or something like you're off the grid, way out in the middle of nowhere, you might be able to use an IBC like this. I'm not recommending this, by the way, but you might be able to get away with using an IBC like this that's been super, super cleaned, super hygienic, and it's also got a known history that this has only been used once, and you know what it was used for, nitrogen fertilizer, and you clean it out extensively, and you filter it. You might be able to get away with something like that, but then of course you have the issue of what chemicals are in the tank that are going to get into your body, and are you comfortable with that, and or will your filtration system take care of that? So, like I said, the question of can you drink the water from an IBC, the answer is quite complicated. Next, we'll talk about lids on IBCs. Now, some lids are like this where they're solid and there's no vent in the top, and that's not really going to work for a rainwater catchment system, because as this thing fills up, you're going to want to allow it to vent. So you might look for an IBC that has a vent on the top. So this is an example of an IBC that does have a vent. So this little rubber ring here has a hole in it, and then that goes down into a little vent in the top of the IBC. And so that's going to allow air to escape so that as the IBC fills, you're not going to have pressure build up inside the tank. Another feature of the lids that you might be interested in is some of them have a removable piece here, and you can screw this out and then you can use that to screw a pipe in through the lid, so you wouldn't have to cut the lid or anything, and you'd have a pipe that seals pretty nicely into this lid. So not all of them have that. There's that one that does, but then this one over here doesn't. So if that's something you're interested in, then whatever IBC dealer that you're working with, you might ask them to get you an IBC with this removable piece here so you can screw a pipe into it. In terms of IBC cages, these cages are fantastic in their own right. I've used these for tons of things. I've used them for worm bins, I've used them for animal feeders, I've used them for, people use them for holding firewood. There's any number of amazing things you can use the cages for. The cages are pretty sturdy. What I've found is that the cages that have this tubular steel tend to be a lot stronger than the ones that have this square tubing. The spot welds on these are something you need to think about, because these spot welds can come off, but I've never seen the spot welds come off the circular tubing. I've only seen the spot welds come off the square tubing. So this is an example of what I mean. This square tubing that I pulled off an IBC, I didn't cut this off. It literally just the spot welds that were holding it to the rest of the cage came loose, and I was able to pull this off literally by hand. And it wasn't even just one of these rings that I was able to pull off. I was able to pull about 3 or 4 of them off of the same IBC. So I'm not sure if it's a quality control thing or if that's just the nature of the welds or what, but yeah, these square tubing cages are the ones that I've seen fail in construction over time. And it's not super common, but it's also not rare. It's something that you will see if you see enough IBCs, but it's also not something that I would lose sleep over. It's just something to be aware of. Next, we'll talk about the pallets on the bottom. These are here to hold the unit and make it easy to maneuver with a forklift or a tractor. And I've found that these plastic pallets on the bottom tend to hold up very well. Many of them have metal components. The metal components will get bent over time, but I've noticed that if the metal pallet is bent, it's usually not really structurally damaged. It's usually just aesthetically kind of ugly when these get bent. But you would want to look at that and make sure that if you're getting a metal pallet, that it is still functional. One thing that's very common is you'll see people who replace a pallet and they'll swap out a metal pallet for a wood pallet. So if the metal pallet gets damaged enough, they say, okay, the IBC is still usable, I'm going to swap it out for this wood pallet. And that's usually a bad deal over time because it starts to corrode relatively quickly. So if you see an IBC that has the pallet replaced with a wooden pallet, you might look elsewhere and say, you know, this unit, it's got a wooden pallet, and I don't trust that it's going to hold up over time, so I'm going to look for a different unit. In terms of the plastic, this plastic can get brittle, and so you really want to be careful with the IBC that you're buying. So let me show you examples of what that looks like when you have an IBC that's cracking, and just how devastating it could be if you wanted to hold water in it. So here I have some pieces from an IBC that the side of it was cracking, and you can see just how brittle it becomes over time. That's going to be affected by multiple different factors. So if it's sitting out in the sun, if the plastic is not UV stabilized, that's going to corrode the plastic, and you'll get weaker plastic over time. You might be transporting some sort of caustic material, right? Some sort of acid or something. That's going to weaken the plastic over time. But this is how brittle it can become. And so you can imagine that if this is next to your house, I don't know how well you can hear that. Let me. So you can imagine if that were right next to your house and you had a big giant storm and all of a sudden your IBC ruptures, that you could see a huge blowout and have water rushing everywhere, potentially getting into a basement or a subfloor or something. So you do want to pay attention to that. And so that's what I've noticed, is that the IBCs that are getting toward the end of their useful life, if you hear a crackling in the plastic, you might want to avoid those IBCs. And then of course there's no telling whether an IBC might fail even if it doesn't have the crackling sound. But if you hear the crackling sound, that's a sure sign that you might want to stay away. This is a great example of where an IBC can start failing, and the way you can test it to see if it might fail, I'm just going to press on the side here, and you can hear that cracking. And so that, obviously, you'd want to avoid this one like the plague and get a different unit. So that's all you need to do, is when you're picking out your IBC, just go up to it, press it on the side, and if you hear any of that cracking, then ask for a different unit. The next thing you want to think about with your IBCs is what type of valve does it have, and how easy is it going to be to find fittings for that valve. And so this is actually going to be the subject of its own video, and keep an eye out for that video, because this is an issue that if you're using these for water storage, you're definitely going to have some headaches when you start trying to work with the many different valves that you see on the different IBCs. So I hope that was a useful introduction to IBCs and what they're used for and how they're used, and some things to look out for when you're thinking about buying IBCs. And we're going to go into more detail with this later on in this series of videos. So I hope you stick around for the rest of the videos, and yeah, we'll see you soon.